So I know that there were a lot of questions that I got which were of a political nature. What I chose to do in the first session was actually hold some of the political questions to this panel, just because A, we were running short on time, and B, this panel I'm going to challenge to really address solutions. The other thing, and I've spoken to the panel, I appreciate from the back especially that it's been a little difficult to hear what we're saying. And so I've asked them all to speak slowly because there is an echo in here. So if it seems like people are speaking frustratingly slowly, it's because we want to be heard. As we jump into the panel, we're going to start with Senator Cyr. I had the absolute privilege of a lifetime to serve as the state senator for the Cape and Islands District for 3 terms from 2010 through 2016. Thank you. And just so privileged and proud that Julian has stepped in without a beat and addressing issues like this. I am going to set the table, though, as Julian walks up, and make the following observation. As we discussed earlier, and I think all 3 panelists touched on it in their own ways, if we address this issue, thinking that the same type of activism that we have approached civil rights or the women's movement or the early environmental movement with the same sense of urgency and accepting the same arc of history, we will literally be underwater in 50 years. Where I will be optimistic is when John Kennedy said in 1963, I believe it was, we will have a human being on the moon by the turn of the next decade, we actually delivered that 2 years early. When we were faced with the threat of World War II, we converted an entire peacetime manufacturing economy into a wartime one to actually win World War II. In about 2 years, we converted our entire manufacturing base. Somebody has made the comment to me that, unfortunately, we never converted it back. I will ascribe to that as well. But when we connect the moral and the spiritual with goals and really get behind it, our political system is an amazing tool. Our democracy can be an amazing tool. I've been there and I've seen that. But that democracy right now, and this is where I am committed, but I challenge my successor here to talk about it. Certainly on a federal level, our democracy right now is broken. So that part of this goal has to be to fix our political system, to realign our economy, so that that which is profitable is consistent with our long-term goals. Because right now, that which is profitable, in many cases, isn't consistent with our long-term goals. And our political system needs to do that. It has the levers, it has the sticks, it has the carrots to say, if we're going to fix this, we demand that our business community and our economy deliver on certain deliverables. We can do it, but it's got to come from rooms like this to make it happen. So without further ado, Julian, I've set a tough table for you.
Thank you, Dan, and thank all of you for being here this afternoon. This is one of those sort of quintessential perfect Cape Cod afternoons, and so I know what all of you are giving up to be here, but I think it's critically important. And also thank you to St. Christopher's for convening us and hosting us, to the Wood's Hole Research Center, and the Faith Communities Environmental Network. I'm especially going to thank Sheila Place, who was so dogged about getting me here, I think over 6 or 7 or 8 months ago, but this is just a really reflective of the real strength I think we have here. I've been asked by the press today, how interesting to have, the faith communities and the environmental communities sort of coming together. I look around the room and I see a lot of overlap. I think a lot of the folks who are involved, most active in our faith communities here on Cape Cod, are also the folks who are driving the environmental movement here, and I think there's a lot of strength on that. And I've got thoughts about how faith can help us in this moment. And I've also think I've got an answer to one of Dan's challenges. First, I just want to give you a little snapshot on some of the pieces of legislation that I've been working on. Massachusetts has traditionally been a leader in this area. In earlier times, we passed the Green Communities Act. In 2008, we've passed a number of pieces of legislation that have put us at the forefront compared to our peer states. So when I got to the legislature, a lot of these sort of key signature issues were already in the works. And as is tradition, if a colleague has filed a bill on a certain issue, you don't go and file the same bill, right? You co-sponsor it and you work with them. But I tried to think really critically, all right, about, what are some of the other areas that we haven't been taking legislation on? And I just want to give you a snapshot of those. We don't have a lot of time today, but I want to make sure you're aware of them and helping us advocate to get those done. And then I'll get into some higher level stuff. The first piece of legislation we've been working on is something called community empowerment. And that essentially allows you as a municipality at your town meeting to basically opt in to say, hey, look, I want to be investing in clean energy through my utility bill. And it's something actually that, Dan, I believe you were a big fan and sponsor of this before me. We've picked up the mantle. It's something we've passed in the Senate. We're trying to get it done, but I think trying to figure out ways where local communities can be empowered, that's community empowerment. The second piece of legislation that's pretty important, I think, as well, is looking at solar promotion, and especially in historic districts. Historic districts abound in Massachusetts. They're especially prevalent on Cape Cod. We actually have the largest single historic district in the country, which is called the Old Kings Highway Historic District. But historic districts have been real barriers around solar installation, which in a place like Cape Cod I find profoundly critical. You're not going to have cute old homes to preserve in the current state that we're going at. So I filed legislation that essentially would require historic districts to treat solar installation like we do with a whole host of other utility-involved hardware. These very attractive power lines that we have are not also historic as well. Those are allowed. Solar panels should be the same. I should mention when we're talking about solar and talking about the promise of green jobs, we've created more green jobs here in Massachusetts than we have coal mining jobs left in the country, right? So there's a real promise with green energy as an employment tool and technology. This is particularly going to be true when Massachusetts builds the first offshore wind project, which is south of Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, and Vineyard Wind. That project, I will say, is stalled by the Trump administration. President Trump's prior Interior Secretary actually was very pro offshore wind and wind development. The current one is a former oil executive, so he feels differently. Another piece of work we've been working on, we're talking about how our ocean chemistry has changed. In last year's session, I got a piece of legislation passed along with Dylan Fernandez, who's the state rep from Woods Hole in the Islands, to have a task force to look at ocean acidification. The actual composition of our oceans are changing. This is a significant threat to our fisheries. It's particularly a steep challenge for the aquaculture industry, which as we've lost other fisheries, aquaculture has been sort of the one sort of rising piece of our fisheries. So stay tuned for that. I've also been a really big fan about looking at sort of the unsexy work, but critical work that government agencies do. The Department of Environmental Protection, the Division of Ecological Restoration, and others does critical work to safeguarding our environment and planning for the future. These agencies have been pretty underfunded historically, particularly since the Great Recession. They haven't been restored. There was an early retirement incentive program that really wiped out these agencies further when Governor Baker came in, and so that's a piece that I've been focusing on. I sort of say these, there's another bill I filed relative to a ban on offshore drilling. So I'm working with the National Conference of Environmental Legislators to make sure that there's an effort that every single state on the eastern seaboard has legislation that not only bans drilling in our state waters, but says you cannot have any activities related to drilling in any of the state's ports. If all of our states pass this, we will have effectively banned offshore drilling on the eastern seaboard without federal action. This is really crucial given the administration that we're living under. So that's just sort of a snapshot of the environmental issues, and particularly the climate change issues we've been working on. There are more. I'm optimistic that we're going to take up a bill. What I also wanted to lay out for you is sort of where things are on Beacon Hill around legislation to address climate disruption. And I should just say climate disruption is a term I've borrowed from one of the presidential candidates, and I like it a lot. Change implies something that could be good. I think I found very little that is good with the climate that is rapidly changing. I think the word climate disruption, I think, has a lot of power in it, and so I'm very purposeful in trying to use that word. So where sort of the state of play is right now is actually, so if you look at Massachusetts politics through a partisan lens, Democrat and Republican, you are missing the boat. It is really about the big three: the governor, the Senate, and the House. And so I'm going to talk about that unholy trinity, if you will, because we are in a church, and sort of explain where we are. The Baker administration, and actually the governor, to his credit, proposed a statewide property tax, an increase in the excise tax on deeds, a 50% increase to pay for climate resiliency efforts. I believe this is like the first significant revenue proposal the guy has proposed. So I'm pretty thrilled about this, actually. It would generate $150 million annually, so that's over $1 billion over 10 years. This is something that we're vetting in the legislature, but I think when you look at actions that we're taking, I'm optimistic that there's actually a proposal on the table that's talking about revenue. The House took action earlier this summer, or at the end of the summer, on what's called a Greenworks package. This again is also focused on resources for basic climate resiliency and adaptation. All the myriad of changes and decisions that are going to have to be made at the local level to respond, primarily around rising seas, but also with more severe storms. We're getting hotter and wetter here, so what does that all mean? Again, good idea. The part that I find a little critical of this is that it's based on bonding, so it's using a mechanism, basically borrowing in our future. It's $100 million for 10 years, so a similar framework as the governor's. From the Senate's perspective, I really feel we need real dedicated revenue for this. I feel that it is inadequate. The problem we're facing is inadequate for $100 million over 10 years. We need double that at least. I'd like to see us advance a proposal. I'm advocating to the Senate President to advance a proposal that's up to $200 million a year over 10 years. This is something our communities need. We've already borrowed against our future, or at least my future and Montana's future. On this problem, we shouldn't be borrowing further on this. We need real revenue, and I think that's something I'm optimistic in the Senate we're going to be having that. In the Senate as well, we're looking at legislation around how do you promote further electric vehicles, battery storage, which is actually really critical for us out here in a place where, look, we've always had challenges with keeping the grid in a very windy place. Those challenges are accelerating. I think, unfortunately, many of you experienced this maybe last week with the recent nor'easter and the power outages that lingered. Battery storage is really critical to connecting, making green energy not only viable, but something we can rely on when the sun isn't shining, when the wind, the wind isn't blowing. We've got a real serious on getting to net zero. And Phil Duffy was talking about this earlier. Massachusetts, I mentioned, we were at the forefront on this issue, and we've really been falling behind. Both California and New York State have a plan to get to net zero by 2045. We don't yet have a plan on that. And I really think that broadly, while we're doing some good things, there's also, I should mention, a $2.4 billion environmental bond bill that was passed with the legislature last year. The governor signed it into law. We should really release these dollars. We're doing some good things, and even the bills I talked about, they're good bills. But I really worry that we're falling behind, that we've been playing it safe, especially these last, 5 or 6 or so years. And I think the crisis we're facing really demands us to stay ahead of the curve. I think Massachusetts, from a policy perspective, does best when we're pushing the envelope, right? This is a state that prides itself on progress, whether it was abolition or education or equal rights for LGBTQ people. And I think in a policy setting, I think back to the days when Dan was your senator and I was working at the Department of Public Health, and every time we wanted to advance an issue, we'd always go and say, well, if we did X policy, Massachusetts would be first in the nation. And that's what perked the ears of lawmakers and policymakers. We're a small state with a big ego, and I think we do well when we're leading, and we haven't been leading. And this is the piece that I really worry about. And so I'm working to advance this and work to advance in the Senate that we pass the most nation-leading piece of legislation that we can. But I think there's also more that we can do. And I want to just outline a few of the steps that I think folks can take. Yes, certainly pressuring me, pressuring Representative Sarah Peake, and others in the delegation, that helps, but we're already with you. And so I think while we're doing the work and while you're supporting us doing this work, we also need to look closer to home. This is the biggest challenge that the 15 towns on Cape Cod are going to face. I would urge each and every one of you to go to your select board meeting, ask what are the 5 priorities your select board is working on. If climate disruption is not one of those 5, something's wrong and something needs to change. We passed a provision actually last year, an environmental bond bill, to create a program for sustainability coordinators for essentially towns who would work together on this problem. Really encourage your towns to embrace these. You get 10 people to show up at a select board meeting, you're going to get their attention on something. So I think finding ways to be hyper-local on this also counts, because we essentially are going to have to make, we now have to make in our communities decisions that we thought would come in the next 40, 50, 100 years. We're having to make decisions that those decisions in the next 10 or 20 years or even sooner, right? So we need that municipal engagement. I think politically, if you want to really do something for the future of this country, I would urge you to get in a vehicle, ideally an electric vehicle, and drive up to New Hampshire this winter and next fall. The outcome of this election will determine whether or not the United States continues to turn its back on our responsibility to the world, or whether or not we get serious on this. This is also, I don't view this actually as a partisan matter. This is actually just critical for the future of our people, this country, and humanity. I also think it's really important for us politically to figure out how do we really transcend the tribalism that is really kind of where folks from a climate perspective have retreated. And then I just want to talk a little bit on the next generation, on Montana's generation, on my generation. My sister actually just had my sister and sister-in-law just had a little baby. And I really think of the world that we're giving to Kian. And it's not a good one. And this is where I think faith can actually be helpful for us, where teachings, whether you're a person of faith or not a person of faith, that this can help provide a framework to move forward. I think that first and foremost, we have no choice but to embrace change. If you think that we're going to be able to preserve roads that are consistently being flooded in our community, or a home that's on a bluff that's going to fall into the ocean, we can't do that anymore, right? And I think we need to embrace change. I think we need to humble ourselves. I also think that forgiveness is a really important conception, and when you hear folks like Greta and Montana who speak, forgiveness is also really important, because there is a truth in this that many of the people here in this room, you were part of a generation who didn't do something and who put us in this situation. And look, there's resentment and there's some issues there about that, but I think what we've got to do as millennials and Generation Z and whatever Kian's generation is going to be called, right? We've got to extend that forgiveness, to have that warm handshake, and to bring that into our work. And I think we have to also ask ourselves, what do we do with the time that we have left? And so those are just some thoughts I have today, and I'll end on this. Dan and others were talking about using this example of the civil rights movement. And I think some real apt critiques about how civil rights has come a really long way, but if you look at the lived experiences of particularly African Americans in this country, we've got a ways to go, right? Feminism, the same. Well, I can offer you a movement where we've seen radical change in this country, and I've seen it in my lifetime, I've seen it in the last decade, and that's the LGBTQ movement, where, you know, I've been out for 15 years. It feels different to be a queer person in 2019 than it did in 2004, and I think that's really a movement we should be looking towards around organizing activism and to make real change. So I thank you for the opportunity to address you all today. I hope I've given you some food for thought, and again, really thank you for everyone.
Thank you, Senator. Senator has another event, so he's gonna be leaving, but before he leaves, I'm gonna ask him a yes/no. It has to be a yes/no. Is there currently any legislation in the State House that would adequately address the 10-year time frame that we now understand is really the time frame in which we have to act decisively, emphatically, and with all energy? Is there any legislation now that hits that 10-year window? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
But you gotta get a pass. You gotta make sure we pass it.
All right, thank you. Next, we're going to hear from Rich Delaney. And again, this is a call for action. Rich Delaney will introduce himself, but has been a true leader on all environmental issues for his entire life and career. So Rich, I want to welcome you and thanks.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you very much, and thank all of you for being here today. Over 300 people are in this room listening to messages about climate change, morality, and science being delivered from the pulpit. This is a powerful spot right here, and I like standing here. And I'll tell you, I was in Paris for the climate change discussions and treaty or agreement in December 2015, and the voices of the faith leaders in Paris were really, really important. You know, the Pope had issued his encyclical, his joint statement, which was very articulate and very powerful, but almost, I believe by now, every other religion in the world and every denomination within those religions have issued similar statements, from Buddhism to Unitarian Universalists. So a lot of these pulpits and altars around the world are spreading the same message. That gives me a great deal of hope, because that's how we start to think about our values, our morality, and that drives our behavior. And that's what's going to help change one by one, but also as societies. Because this climate change crisis that we're dealing with cuts across every fabric of our society, of our economy, of our politics, and all the way down the line. And while we're talking about morality on an individual basis, Dan said this, I'm going to reinforce it, we need to begin to reinsert morality in our political process. But we need to reinsert and establish morality in our economic system, our capitalism. That's the big fundamental, those are the fundamental changes that have to happen. So I'm really thrilled we're all here today thinking about this, and we need to continue to spread the word. Dan gave me license to talk about politics, and I really was thrilled to hear Senator Cyr's agenda of bills. That suite of legislation on the state level really is the way we have to push, but we need leaders. We need to elect leaders in every level of government to do that. I also would like, and I think Andy Gottlieb, who is a selectman, will talk about this, but I have seen very little action at the local level in our boards of select people, in our local, so there needs to be, and that's where we guys can have most of our influence, is our local selectmen. And I also will say, the Green New Deal on the federal level is the arena and the forum, the framework for real action in the Congress. And the leader of the Green New Deal is our own very senator, well, his co-leader, of course, is Senator Ed Markey. And if we do not return Ed Markey to the Senate next year, it will be a colossal catastrophe for the environment. And it's nothing more than that, so nothing less than that. I'll finish I only have 3 minutes here, so I'm going fast, but I have to speak slowly. I just want to mention the Cape Cod Climate Change Collaborative. When I came back from Paris, a lot of people, yourselves included, said, what can we do here in Cape Cod? So a group of us have established this informal network of entities who are focused on trying to find action steps in each of our different sectors. It's the finance sector, the government sector, the agricultural sector, the transportation sector, right down the line, where specific actions need to happen on Cape Cod so that we as Cape Codders can reach a goal that the Cape Cod Climate Change Collaborative has established of having reduced our production of carbon dioxide by 50% by 2030, just 10 years from now. And that parallels exactly what the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has set as a target. If we do not globally reduce our production of CO2 in the next 10 years, we will have precious little chance of reaching or avoiding those tipping points that Phil Duffy was talking about earlier. So that's how critical and urgent the motion is. But I'm not going to go through all of the actions that we came up with. We just finished our second annual Net Zero Conference a week ago Thursday. A lot of you may have, some of you I'm sure participated, and we've established very specific actions, about 40 of them, that we'd like to have Cape Codders to take to help get this. Go to capecodclimate.org, capecodclimate.org, and you'll see coming up soon all of those actions and ways that you can get involved in your own local as Cape Codders, basically. And even beyond that, as individuals, you can go to our carbon footprint calculator, which is also on that website, and literally check a few boxes and say, what kind of a car do I drive? How many light bulbs did I not change, or did I change? And what that will tell you pretty accurately how much CO2 your lifestyle and you and all of our lifestyles is producing. And then the next column of decisions is, what if I bought the Prius next year, or an electric car, instead of that SUV? What if I went to the Cape Light Compact and had them come in for free and give me an energy audit and all free LED light bulbs? What would that do? What if I did this, that? What if I gave up meat one day a week? How would that reduce the carbon footprint with all that stuff coming from the Amazon? Then you could see how you individually could change your own carbon footprint. And if everyone did that in Cape Cod, we could reach that target of 50% reduction. I think I'm out of time. Thanks, Dan. Thank you.
So I said to everybody, you got to talk really slowly, but you don't have much time. I appreciate the incongruity of that. I also want to point out that Rich is the director at the Center for Coastal Studies, which is based in Provincetown, but now has a worldwide footprint relative to a lot of issues as it relates to our marine environment, but specifically now as it relates to climate change. So I would actually invite you all to go to the Center for Coastal Studies website as well, because I think that's a very powerful place to be. So thank you for that, Rich. Next, we have Andrew Gottlieb, who I have known for many, many years. He's a leader both in the town of Mashpee. He sits on the Board of Selectmen, but now is the executive director of the Association to Preserve Cape Cod. Very involved in the climate change initiative here on the Cape, but running what is unarguably, I think, the premier environmental organization and conservation organization on the Cape. Andrew?
So, several years ago, before I went to APCC, I was doing some consulting, and I was down in South Carolina, and this person in a slow southern drawl looked at me and said, "Boy, you talk fast." So forget about it, Dan. Not going to happen. So, a couple things that I'd like to try and add to this conversation. I think it's great that we're having this conversation, but marrying the science with the morality part of it, and the religious organizations part of it, without adding an effective political strategy and a degree of involvement won't change a thing. Okay, so if you look at, and I'll try and be careful for a change, if you look at the strategy of the right over the last 40 years, there's a couple of sacrosanct principles upon which their entire political strategy is based. And it's around Second Amendment and abortion rights. And whether the political winds blew favorably nationally for the right or unfavorably, whether they were in office in the presidency or whether they, during the 8 years of the Obama administration, 8 years of the Clinton administration, were outside of power in parts of Washington, they methodically drove from the local level candidates who supported those two issues, took control of local boards of selectmen, county commission seats, state legislatures, governors, and in doing so, changed the conversation about what was important politically in this country, controlled the map, controlled the allocation of resources, built a bench of people in the judiciary and the political environment who, when things worked for their favor and they began to control the national conversation, they had those people in place, ready to go to implement their agenda. And it didn't really matter.